We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this?
Are you rethinking this policy?
Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, has announced that the Palestine marches on Armistice Day do not meet the threshold required to ask for a ban, in spite of the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, saying it should not go ahead. Unless there is sufficient evidence of a risk to a serious breach of public order, there are, according to the Commissioner, no powers to stop the protest. The reparations debate reignites as Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurance marketplace, commits itself to £50 million of reparation payments following a report into its historical slavery links. But it was only a matter of time until the firm was accused of not paying enough. Power in the 21st century Britain has been usurped by institutions known only by their acronyms, the IMF, OECD and perhaps worst of all, the OBR. But a new report has suggested the OBR was wrong again. The good news is the Chancellor may be in pole position to let you keep more of your own money. Plus, it's the 400th anniversary of the first folio, perhaps the most influential book ever published, containing 36 of Shakespeare's plays, released 7 years after his death. Today we celebrate the first folio's 400th birthday and note the fact that the Americans have more copies than we do. State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by a pugnacious panel this evening, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. As you know, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, you've all been waiting for it. It's the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB newsroom is that the Prime Minister has today welcomed assurances from the Metropolitan Police that the pro-Palestinian march planned for this weekend during the nation's annual period of remembrance will be routed away from the Cenotaph in London. Rishi Sunak spoke with the Met Police Chief Sir Mark Rowley today amid concerns the march could interfere with remembrance commemorations. In a statement, though, the Prime Minister described the decision to carry on with the march as disrespectful and offensive. The London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, said the policing of protests shouldn't become political, and the Met insisted it's keeping the weekend's events under constant review. But the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, said Sir Mark Rowley will be held accountable for any disruption.
This is the operational responsibility of the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. The legal powers are his to request that. He has to make a judgment based on all of the factors that he has to take into account. And as the Prime Minister said, it's the Met's responsibility to make sure the march goes off safely, and we'll hold him to account for that.
Meanwhile, in Israel, the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt has been closed because of security concerns tonight. The Foreign Office said more than 150 British nationals did manage to leave Gaza via the crossing last evening. And that comes as the Israeli military says Hamas has lost control in northern Gaza and thousands of residents are moving south. Israel says it won't reoccupy the Gaza Strip or control it for an extended period of time. Meanwhile, here at home, the Welsh Parliament has called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. 24 members of the Senate voted in favour of the motion, with 19 against. Meanwhile, a war memorial in Greater Manchester is still being guarded by police tonight after protesters sprayed Free Palestine graffiti across its base. Greater Manchester Police said the cenotaph in Rochdale was vandalised and poppies were removed yesterday afternoon, and it's currently a crime scene. Both the police and Rochdale Council have condemned the vandalism as criminal disrespect, which is totally unacceptable. Now, the government's long-running dispute with rail unions that's led to widespread train strikes over recent months may soon be over. After talks between the Rail Delivery Group and the RMT union, a plan has now been set out in what's been described as a mutually agreed way forward. It includes a pay rise backdated to 2022 and job security guarantees. The RMT says it welcomes the move, but members must now vote on whether or not to accept the offer. A former Cabinet Secretary has told the COVID inquiry today he urged Boris Johnson to remove Matt Hancock as Health Secretary during the pandemic. Lord Sedwill, who was Cabinet Secretary until the autumn of 2020, said he raised his concerns with Boris Johnson privately in the summer of that year. And earlier today, he apologised for his suggestion that chickenpox-style parties may have helped spread COVID immunity early on in the pandemic. He's now said sorry to the families of victims and accepted his suggestions may have come across as heartless. This is GB News across the UK and now across Europe. A warm welcome this evening to new viewers and listeners away from the UK who are tuning in for the first time today via satellite. Details on how to stay in touch at gbnews.com. See you in an hour.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner today announced that the law's threshold has not been met to stop the planned Palestine protests this Saturday on Armistice Day. He's come under fire for this from the Prime Minister, who met him earlier today to hold him to account.
Yeah, this is a decision that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner has made, and he has said that he can ensure that he safeguards remembrance for the country this weekend, as well as keep the public safe. Now, my job is to hold him accountable for that, and we've asked the police for information on how they will ensure that this happens.
But it's right that Sir Mark Rowley is the one to judge, and it's right that the Prime Minister is there to hold him to account. We live in a free country, and in a free country, the right to protest is one that needs to be protected. Freedom of speech is essential to how our country is governed, and therefore it ought to be difficult to ban marches. It ought to be difficult to ban marches that we don't like, as well as ones that we do like. It is essential for a free country, and it's right that it shouldn't be a political decision, because as soon as you make it a political decision, is it being banned by a Conservative government? Would it be a Labour government who bans it? Which government would allow it? You have all those issues coming up as to whether it's a political decision or an evidence decision. Now, I think that the organisers, out of respect for Armistice Day and the Remembrance Weekend, should cancel it as a sign of respect and of their Britishness, of being part of this nation. But they have the right not to accept that advice, as long as the march is peaceful. And this is where the Commissioner has power, has authority, has something that he can do. Because if he thinks, if he has evidence that there could be serious disorder, he is entitled to ban it. And this is where he is taking a risk in not banning it. Because as he has decided it can go ahead, if it turns out to be disorderly, then he is responsible, and possibly even his job and reputation would be on the line. And the risk he's taking shouldn't be minimised, because there's already been disorder on some of these marches, including a man with an Israeli flag being chased and needing police protection, and the vandalism that Polly was telling you about a few moments ago at the Rochdale Cenotaph, a really nasty and disgraceful piece of violent property damage. So if there's public disorder, the police commissioner is responsible for not having cancelled the protest. So it's a question that is rightly taken by a policeman, not by a politician. It's a question that the politicians are right to discuss and put pressure on the policeman for. It's also right to ask people, as a matter of respect, not to march. But when our way of life is under threat, surely the answer is not to abandon our way of life. As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I am delighted that Nigel is doing overtime this evening. He's not working to rule or anything like that. He's stayed on to discuss this. Nigel, thank you for staying.
Jacob, your optimism, that you respectfully ask people not to march as a mark of their Britishness. The problem is many of those marching hate us. They hate what we stand for, they hate our values, they have no respect for this country's history, for its background, for its culture. And what we're seeing is an aspect of multiculturalism that has failed horrendously.
Well, integration is the key to successful race relations, and there's clearly a problem that has come from mass migration, 600,000 last year. Meaning that integration has not taken place.
No, it hasn't happened at all. In communities like this, there is no evidence of it whatsoever. But, Jacob, here's the point. These people are going to come to London on Saturday. Had the march been called off a few days ago, it might have been possible to maintain some sense of order in London. These people are coming. The question is, how do we deal with it? I think Mark Rowley, frankly, is being cowardly. I mean, after all, the Met banned an EDL march in East London in 2011 on the basis, there are known troublemakers on that march that could cause violence. We've seen 3 successive Saturdays in a row some appalling behaviour.
Mark Rowley must be pretty sure that there won't be violence, because he's got every opportunity to ban it on the grounds of serious public disorder.
There's been violence the last 3 Saturdays. Why wouldn't there be violence this Saturday? And the risks are worse this week. The risks are worse because you haven't just got, on Saturday, a wreath laying at 11 o'clock at the Cenotaph. You go all around West London. There are divisional memorials, regimental memorials, and there'll be gatherings of veterans at all of those.
And they don't all take place at 11 o'clock in the morning, do they? They take place at various times.
All different times during the day.
That's absolutely right.
Sadiq Khan, by the way, who got rid of Cressida Dick, who has considerable power over the Met Commissioner, hasn't said a word, said, "Not me, Gov." And the government don't want to get involved.
Well, the government has tried to get involved, but it doesn't have the power to ban it. But if
it could use emergency powers.
But Nigel, if we are to win the battle of ideas, the battle of cultures, don't we stand up for our culture, which does allow freedom of speech?
So, and I understand the power of that point. Equally, I fully understand. Well, we sacrificed a lot in World War so that we could agree to disagree. There's a compromise here. There is a good compromise here. You allow the pro-Palestinians to come to London on Saturday. You allow them to assemble, to gather in Hyde Park. So that is yours, and you can have it from midday till 5 o'clock in the evening or whatever it is. But if you step outside of that and start protesting outside regimental memorials or whatever it is, you will be arrested.
And that
strikes me as being a reasonable
compromise. That seems a really sensible idea. It's also something where the government would potentially have the power to get injunctions and so on to protect areas that they thought were particularly sensitive.
Yeah, I think from all angles this works. It's too late just to ban this march.
Because people are already coming.
They've booked train tickets, there are coaches coming from Dewsbury.
Let's get back to Sir Mark Rowley's position, because he does have the power to ask for it to be banned, and the Home Secretary would definitely agree if she got the request. By saying that there isn't sufficient evidence to ban it, he must be confident, in spite of what you say over the last 3 weekends, that there won't be violence.
Well, his force have been turning a blind eye to violence, turning a blind eye to people shouting jihad, turning a blind eye to many pro-Hamas messages. They've been turning a blind eye.
Which are clear breaches of the law.
Clear breaches of the law, breaches of the Terrorism Act, actually, in some cases. And they've been turning a blind eye for 3 weeks. And I guess he thinks, well, there are more of them than there are of us on the streets. And a lot of people, Jacob, feel very, very angry. A chap walks down a high street in East London and films Palestinian flags and says, why on earth are all these people here? And he's facing a court, a trial at some point in the future. And there's a feeling that actually we're giving in again and again and again to the pro-Palestinian lobby.
Whereas the law should be blind, as statues of justice always have justice blindfolded.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't seem to be what we're getting.
No, but so, as I say, I think my idea for a compromise actually would suit pretty much everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible one and would allow freedom of expression to be maintained and law and order to be maintained as well, which is what we all want.
Perhaps they'll listen, you never know.
Listen to you, Nigel.
You never
know.
know.
They had to in 2016. Anyway, thank you very much to Nigel. State of the Nation panellist, Dr. Tessa Dunlop, hasn't managed to come in this evening because she was with a World War II veteran. But she was kind enough to ask her and her friend, the former chairman of the Bromsgrove Conservative Association, what they thought of the planned Palestine protests. And the people have spoken.
I prefer that everybody just joined together and remembered why we wear poppies, why we still, I don't know whether celebrate's the right word, but commemorate Poppy Day.
Now, let me put that to our very own World War II veteran. Are they allowed to protest on the Saturday if that doesn't have services on that day or not?
Well, as long as they don't become disruptive, I suppose, if the Saturday's free in a sense, that's all right. But I don't think it's fair to interrupt our normal Remembrance Sunday.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by my panel, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. Kelvin, isn't it right that if people are going to protest peacefully, that's fine, and right that the police power is only if they expect disorder?
Yeah.
The difficult question is, why is Rowley not expecting disorder when, as Nigel pointed out, there was disorder over the last 3 weeks?
Yes, of course, I don't want to be too personal about it, but I imagine Sir Mark's buttocks are very firmly clenched most of Saturday, that there's not an outrage of any kind, really, because were there, he has to go. So we would be in a very difficult position, I think, then. But if we cancelled it, then we, in some ways, I think we're in a worse position, to be honest. I mean, our country has always been open to people having the other thoughts. I'm old enough to remember Grosvenor Square in Vietnam. So that kind of any viewers
was killed
yeah.
on that day. I remember well.
Oh right, okay. So you know, so the issue now I feel sorry for the police. There's not going to be 70,000 there. Honestly, I don't want to identify it, but I mean, Nigel mentioned Dewsbury. There will be a lot of people from the religion that feels under the cosh who will want to come and demonstrate. I expect that number to be way over 100,000. And how many police officers are they going to be able to deal with that, or anybody who wants to break away? And the other one final point I'd like to make is I wouldn't like to be wearing a yarmulke in West London when this march was going by. I can't believe that this... So if I'm Jewish and I'm in West London right now, I'm not going out of my house, even although it's my Sabbath. You know, this is a difficult day.
I think your point earlier on, echoing, I think it was Lord Justice Sedley's comment that freedom to speak inoffensively is no freedom at all, it's very well made. But I think this is more than that. Look, if it was banned, the people would still come. They'd just pour out of the tube stations. But there's also another aspect of it. There's the one that Kelvin and you both rightly identified. You know, at Greenford, we'll be meeting at the War Memorial there on the 11th hour of the 11th day. There's also, don't forget, there's this other group, this counter-demonstration, the football fans, who've announced that they're going to turn up there. And, you know, I'm not going to say anything more about them. All I know is that there is a large group of people who are actually opposed to this particular march. But the other thing is that the Palestinian, people, Solidarity with Palestine organisation, they're actually going to be marching on the American embassy. That's not the American embassy that we talked about.
No, it's the new
American
one.
embassy in Nine Elms. Over, you know, they're going to come down from Marble Arch down that way. If they do that, then they will not be going anywhere near Whitehall. They'll not be going near the Lutchin Cenotaph, and I think we can live with that. However, you know, and I know, and you know, that there will be people associated with this who will be intoxicated on the day, not alcoholically intoxicated, but just the emotional feeling of this. And who knows what they're going to do. They could easily break away, because we saw what those... I can't think of the words. I can't use the words on air to describe the people, the two young men in Rochdale who defaced a war memorial, a memorial to people who gave their lives for the very freedom that they are spurning and destroying. So watch out for Saturday.
I mean, it's going to be a very difficult day, and Stephen's point is a very good one, that how many police are there? I mean, how many can we bring out?
Well, what they do is they bring them in, obviously, from...
They're coming from Hertfordshire and Oxford.
Yeah, and everybody... And
but on the other hand, they could be busy.
There aren't enough. Yeah. Now, the other aspect is that among the leaders... Let's just deal with the real issue on this. Among the leaders who have given their undertaking that there is going to be no violence, which is what Rowley is banking his career on, and perhaps somebody's injuries on, is the fact that at least two of them have, in their past, have been endorsers of Hamas, right? I mean, honestly, you would have thought that these people would keep very, very quiet now, but now they lead probably the biggest demonstration this country has ever seen. I do not... So I move towards the Braverman position on this, that if these people endorse Hamas, or have done in the past, it becomes a hate march.
It's no point in moving to the Home Secretary's position if we haven't got enough police to stop the march taking place, is there? Yeah. In which case, I mean, this is a defence of Rowley, that if he thinks he can't police it, it is better to try and manage the crowd than it is to stop it and find that the police are overwhelmed by the numbers who just turn up.
But look, policing works best. In fact, it really only works when it's policing by consent.
By consent.
Yeah. And believe you me, these people are not going to consent. Therefore, we have a real problem there. And as I said, if it were to be banned, do you honestly think that people would say, oh, fine, I shall respect the rule of the law? These are people who have actually shown their contempt for the rule of law and contempt for the British way of life. So do you honestly think they're not going to come pouring out? And in some ways, it could be worse. So what I'd like to do on Saturday is what we'll be doing in Greenford. We'll be standing there in dignity, in respect, and showing that we have nothing but silent, withering contempt for those who have such an appalling perspective on human life.
OK, one final point. In the event... Look, let's hope to God that 100,000, 150,000 people turn up and it all goes off fantastically, which will be a great triumph for Sir Mark, right, to be honest.
Unless one police officer is injured.
Right.
Even if one police officer is injured.
OK, so, right, if there is a problem, the problem is not just for that march. It is a problem going forward in what I would describe as a divided society. When you look at the background...
I think that's a conversation we will have to come back to. But thank you to my panel. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, should we defund the UN? And plus, should Lloyds of London, not Lloyds Bank, Lloyds of London, pay reparations?
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time.
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing the Palestine Armistice Day protests, and we've been getting some of your thoughts. Ian says, the police do not exist to look after your sensitivities. Once one march is banned, the floodgates are opening to ban others. And Sandy, Jacob, I don't think this is just about the marches. What about the veterans coming off trains and buses on their way to the cenotaph? How will the police be able to protect them? Amidst the backdrop of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, Boris Johnson commissioned an extensive review of racial disparities in the UK, headed by Tony Sewell. And it concluded that while racism remains a problem in the UK, this nation is not institutionally racist. But more than this, it was a landmark report that delved into complex and multifaceted layers of disparities that exist between groups and the causes leading to them. And socio-economic and geographical contexts had as big an impact as race. Well, the United Nations Working Group on People of African Descent then foolishly accused the report, of which 10 out of the 11 authors were from ethnic minorities, of, quote, normalising white supremacy. As Daniel Lord Hannan has pointed out in the Daily Mail today, another UN report has been published accusing the UK of having inefficient welfare programmes in spite of our vast spending on it, claiming that a fifth of the UK lives in poverty. Unfortunately, we give the United Nations £1.7 billion of your money every year, which it then spends having a go at us for no good reason and being quite incapable of being able to do its real job. Surely it's time we took the money away. Well, I've got my panel with me still, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. Why do we pay money to a pretty useless, ineffective body that just offends us?
Well, it's a marvellous question to start with. Look, Dr. Sewell was actually ostracised violently by people within his own academic community. He was attacked uphill and down dale for his statement, and I think we pay credit to him for what he did. Look, the first time I came across the United Nations, apart from an academic link with the League of Nations and, all that, sort of business from back in the 20s, was when I saw them in the Congo with the Blue Berets and that. They were a peacekeeping force. The United Nations should exist as a global force for peace and order and good. It should not be a global force for critiquing countries and having cheap potshots at us, because it's a risible attempt anyway, but it also devalues the principle of the United Nations, which is supposed to be a global force for decency.
So would you take the money away?
I don't think we're paying it anyway, are we?
1.7 billion,
well,
apparently.
I think that's what we're supposed to pay. I mean, I know the Americans aren't.
The Americans don't pay, but I think we do. Kelvin?
Well, when you go into the detail of that report, which would basically saying that we should raise universal benefits, universal credit, but which he said that £85 a week was too little. I think the issue that really he should have focused on is why is it we have millions of people who appear to be perfectly all right, who don't bother to go to work. If you want the biggest laugh in the world, go and see a retired or ex-person who worked for Job Centre Plus and ask them what it was like to listen to the load of old rhubarb that people came up every week, why, A, they couldn't turn up for a job, why this job wasn't appropriate, how they developed a club foot from driving a van, and all the ridiculous things. But he doesn't focus on that. He comes to a Western country, I mean, I think we're the 6th or 7th richest country in the world, and he explains to us that we've got to give more of that money to people who actually clearly don't want the work. Now, we're just going to go into a rather tricky period that's coming up right now, where people who do want to work are potentially going to be made redundant, right? So there will be plenty of tension about that. But we have a lot of people in this country who do absolutely sweet FA and get paid a lot of money on benefits.
I think that's a fair. I think your main point, Jacob, if I may say, was that what's the United Nations for? Why are we paying it for? And the League of Nations came into being after the First War because it was the war to end all wars. We didn't want another world war. The United Nations for the same thing. It is no longer a united. It is now a disuniting nations. It is divisive.
Is it
not
worth
uniting.
spending money on the United Nations in the hope that it can do its job better? Would you justify it on that ground?
I'd show them a yellow card, not a red.
OK, so you think you could do better? Kelvin?
The truth about the matter is it's been hijacked, hasn't it? I mean, I think...
OK.
I mean, are you ridiculous? The Russians now decide whether a country like Ukraine should fight for its freedom. It is ludicrous.
All right. Well, in other news, Lloyd's of London, and I'll reiterate, not Lloyd's Bank, apparently put a picture up of a black horse or of the Lloyd's Bank logo, so it's definitely not, so sorry for that. Lloyd's of London, the insurance brokerage place, has pledged £50 million in reparations after a report conducted by John Hopkins that suggested the world's largest insurance marketplace played a central role in the transatlantic slave trade, profited from it and heavily campaigned against its abolition. However, it was only moments later when it was accused of, quote, reparations washing because the figure is far too small. Kelvin, should they be paying reparations in the first place? Isn't paying reparations for something that happened over 200 years ago just ridiculous?
It is absurd. And honestly, if you think that there will be a division if there's any violence on Saturday, if we as a government decide to start handing out money to anybody connected with being their families connected in any way with the slave trade, it will be ridiculous. Andrew Carnegie Brown has been running, one of the great insurance pandrandrums. He's a great man, even in his own mind. He's a great man. I'm not wishing to be unkind about the fella. The idea that they pay out £50 million because something happened 200 years ago. Lloyd's Bank has been going through a very rough time, and it's decisions like that.
Lloyd's of London, not Lloyd's Bank.
Actually, you're right. I've got it. I've got the virus. No, it is a poor decision, and they've just got caught up in the general sense of, I can't use the word, can I use the word blackmail? But the general sense of blackmail, of companies being forced to hand over money.
But Jacob, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
But Stephen, isn't this very welcome for us? Yeah. Because we can now ask for reparations for the monastic lands. And isn't it about time we got our property back for Holy Mother?
Including Westminster Abbey. I mean,
obviously, start there.
Just to start with. But look, if we're going to get reparations from the King of Dahomey, the Sultans of Togo and the entire Arab slave aristocracy, then we can talk realistically. But I actually weep for Lloyd's of London. They've offered to salvage their conscience, to salve their conscience by giving £50 million. And the response is not being, thank you for finally recognising. That's not nearly enough.
But doesn't that serve them right for being naive and for doing something that's a really stupid thing to do?
You'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh.
Yeah, if they've just turned... I hope any bosses watching this of major corporations, of which there will be quite a few, strangely, right, I hope they learn from Lloyd's of London and say, if you give a penny, you're in trouble. They would do better to say, we are not doing this, right? Yeah. Treat every one of your employees generously. Yeah, I'm in favour of that. The idea of a version of reparation or doing what they're doing, which is basically creating an amount of money which is going to make some of their employees of colour feel better about themselves, is an insult to intelligent people of colour.
I'm with you on actually reparations for the monastic lands. I think it's about time that Henry VIII's descendants were actually brought to the bar of the criminal court and actually arraigned for this.
What is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and I'm very glad you used the old and formal saying inch and L rather than a more modern inch and a mile. So we only get the best out of Kelvin and Stephen. So
Jacob, I'm old Labour by any definition.
Excellent, yes. I haven't heard an inch and an L in a very long time. Coming up, a new report reveals the Treasury will collect billions more than first thought. So should you be allowed to keep more of your own money? Plus, guess which GB News presenter is a doctor of Renaissance poetry?
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Can you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you 3.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing whether Lloyd's of London should pay reparations and if we should defund the UN. And this is what you've had to say, William. The UN is totally ineffective and toothless. It's time to stop funding these jobs for the boys. It's been hijacked and is totally ineffective. And Brian, what rubbish this reparations stuff is. I wonder when the Scots will be wanting payouts for us English invading Scotland around 1200 and 1296 and the rest, etc. It would cost us a fortune. I think we should ask for some reparations from the Danes for their invasions in, gosh, what, the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries. One of the problems with the loss of confidence in politicians is the empowerment of non-democratic institutions. It began with the Bank of England's independence, which has fostered a culture of bureaucratic groupthink in our monetary policy decisions. But it's perhaps best embodied by the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, which now thinks it's in charge of fiscal policy. It's overly cautious with a Treasury orthodoxy-dominated approach that has been damaging our economy and leading to bad decision-making. But a new report from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research has suggested that soaring inflation will hand the Treasury billions more than anticipated. It's because of fiscal drag, with an expectation of a budget surplus by the end of the decade. In other words, the ABR, not for the first time, has been making errors in its forecasts. So the autumn statement approaching later this month, surely this is the perfect opportunity for the Chancellor to bring in some much-needed tax cuts. Well, I'm joined now by Robert Palmer of Tax Justice UK. Robert, thank you for coming in again.
Good evening.
The ABR's forecasts have not got a good track record, and it's very interesting that this report suggests that from essentially fiscal drag, revenues will be much higher. Isn't it time to give money back to people?
I mean, I think what we can see around the country is failing public services. You have almost 8 million people waiting for NHS treatment. You have schools that are literally crumbling around our teachers and our children. You have other ways in which our public infrastructure is just not working. And so I think really if the government, if the Chancellor had more money, what I would like to see, what we would like to see at Tax Justice UK is more investment in the type of public services. And just to finish, the UK, in terms of our overall tax rates, it's very similar to comparable countries in Europe. Where we're really lacking is on investment. And Jacob, you're a businessman. If you don't invest, you quickly run into trouble.
Well, I always question government investment because I think governments are bad at investing, as we've seen with the HS2 errors. But on the health service has had enormous amounts of money pumped into it. Then you need to get productivity out of the NHS before you start putting more money in.
I agree. We do need to get more productivity in the NHS, and part of the problem is that doctors and nurses are having to operate in hospitals that aren't functioning properly or with out-of-date equipment, and you can see the sort of short-termism of what governments have done. So this winter, the NHS has asked for an extra 600 million to stop it falling over, and what the government has said is no more money, you have to take this out of your existing budgets. And so what's going to happen is the NHS will raid the budgets for investment, which will drive up productivity. So really the answer is not cutting further, it's investing to ensure we have the public services we all deserve. I just wonder
whether we're coming to similar conclusions from different ways, because one of my concerns is, for example, the Treasury orthodoxy over training doctors. So we have thousands of people every year who want to go to medical school, and we have a shortage of doctors. And we have the Treasury refusing to allow these people to go to medical school because it limits the number, thinking it knows how many doctors the NHS will want in a few years' time. And I would like to see a freer market in medical school places, because I think you would then find you had more doctors and you filled the places, and probably supply and demand would match. And this is being obstructed by Treasury short-termism. I have a feeling you might agree with that.
I actually think this is one of the areas where we do agree, which is the Treasury has a very short-term attitude, which is it's very accounting-based. It's like, do the numbers add up, rather than thinking about what our country needs in the long term to prosper and to grow.
And to grow, because, you see, I think the economy will grow more and you can pay for more public services with lower tax rates. And our tax rates are reaching, by our own terms, high levels, the highest in 70 years. And I think that's more important than the international comparisons, because our growth rate depends on our circumstances and the motivations and culture of our people rather than how they do it in France. And that is weighing on economic growth, which makes it harder then to pay for the public services that you and I both want to see.
I mean, there are lots of things weighing on public services, and, one of them is around health. And we are quite a sick country at the moment. And as I said, we've got this huge NHS backlog. And so there are people that could be working but can't be working because they're ill. And I think the wider point for me is that the state of public services, and we have spending cuts that are baked into the plans for future years, which means that public services are going to get even worse. I really struggle to see why tax cuts are the right priority right now. And they're not what the public want either.
Well, but you say spending cuts. The NHS has been protected from spending cuts. It was protected throughout the age of austerity, and during the pandemic it got all the money it could possibly use. It's spending what's now £180 billion a year. And yet the outcomes are no better, and productivity is worse than it used to be. So it's not about money going into health services, it's about structures and efficiency.
I mean, I agree. Structures, efficiency, we do need to improve both of them. And there are definitely ways the NHS could improve and could do a better job. But at the moment, it is struggling from crisis to crisis. And partly that's because, the infrastructure of the NHS is crumbling. It doesn't have, a heresy. It doesn't have enough middle managers. At the moment, you have doctors and nurses doing admin. This is very overqualified people doing admin. So there are lots of ways in which we could improve the NHS, but it will need more money.
If 90 billion has come from fiscal drag, that's actually not a tax cut if you give it back to people. It's leaving them in their same position. Fiscal drag is a tax increase for people who in London are not particularly high earners. Is that right?
I mean, I think governments of both stripes have used fiscal drag, which is where you freeze the threshold, so income tax threshold stays the same over a number of years while inflation is high. and so you pay more tax. Governments, both Labour and Conservative, have used that. I don't think it's necessarily a very fair way of saying to people, we need to think about how we raise more taxes. I mean, the overall problem is we have public services which haven't had enough investment and are really struggling. We have more cuts that are baked into the future. And so really the priority right now shouldn't be cutting taxes. If anything, if we do want to cut taxes on people, we should think about shifting our tax system so we focus on taxing work and unearned income as opposed to taxing work. So if we want to do tax cuts and shifting the tax system, that's what I would do.
Tax efficiency and tax reform is another discussion which I look forward to having. Thank you, Robert. Coming up, we'll be celebrating the 400th birthday of Shakespeare's first folio. And can you guess which GB News presenter is a doctor of Renaissance poetry?
Coming up on GBN tonight with me, Mark Dolan. Should this weekend's pro-Palestinian march on Armistice Day go ahead? Lee Anderson joins me live in the studio, and he reacts to Carol Vorderman's sensational axing by the BBC. Plus, I asked Tom Bower if Rishi Sunak has already conceded the next election, and would a Labour government mean 5 years of chaos? Join me for 2 hours of feisty debate, 9 to 11 on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing whether it's time for you to keep more of your own money, and we've been getting your views. Harry says, we need the autumn budget to shake things up, but nothing would make me happier to see the OBR proved wrong again. Oh, it will be. And Helen, this government has to get better at investment. HS2 is a clear symbol of how it got it so wrong. Well, on this very day, 400 years ago, one of the most extraordinary books in English literary history was published. William Shakespeare's first folio was initially assembled by his friends John Heminges and Henry Condell. The duo went through the painstaking task of collecting the scraps and fragments of the 36 Shakespeare plays that had been published previously in smaller quarto editions. I think it is worth explaining what is a folio and what is a quarto. Well, it's how books were printed historically. A folio, if you can see, is a large sheet of paper folded twice like this, and then you print on all 4 pages, and so you've got 4 pages of text. A quarto is simply folded over again, so it's half the size, and a smaller book, a less impressive book than a folio. That's all the difference is, and it was how books were, as I say, printed in the early days of, indeed, quite a long part of the history of printing. And had this not happened, without their work to create the first folio, we would have lost several of Shakespeare's best-known plays, including Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and The Tempest, potentially forever. A total of 235 first folios are known to survive today. 1/3 of these are held at the Folger Library in America. And on what should be a day for celebration of our national poet, it's worth remembering that this has become a global rather than simply a national achievement. And so many of the quotations we use in daily life come from Shakespeare. So if you've ever been in a pickle, gone on a wild goose chase, or took something in one fell swoop, and I could go on forever, really, with these quotations, you owe a debt to Shakespeare and the first folio, which helped preserve these brilliant phrases. Well, I'm now joined by the director of Renaissance Poetry, better known to GB News viewers as the host of our very own Free Nation, Andrew Doyle. Andrew, thank you very much. It's a wonderfully important book, isn't it?
Incredibly so. I had the fortune to peruse a first folio when I was at university. I was taken down to the basement of Wadham College, and they keep a copy down there by my supervisor. He wasn't meant to do it, but he did. And there's something quite magical about being able to see this book. As you say, I mean, there's 36 plays in the folio, 18 of which, half of which had never been published before. And as you say, those old quarto editions, they're not as robust, shall we say, as the folio. So this preserved this, and were it not for his 2 friends from the King's Men, actors in the company and also partners in the company, who said to themselves, we need to preserve these for posterity. If you think about losing Macbeth and Julius Caesar and Coriolanus and The Tempest and As You Like It, and, you know, all these plays we would have lost had they not gone to the trouble of doing that. And it was particularly interesting at the time because this wasn't the norm. Ben Jonson had preserved his own works in 1616 in a big folio because he wanted to see his own work preserved. But no one had ever done this. That contained poetry as well and prose. This was the first folio text which was purely for drama, purely for playwriting. Really important that we have it.
And it was immediately not a book for actors because that was much too big and inconvenient to be used if you were learning your lines. It was a book for scholars and for literary people, and therefore underpins so much of subsequent English literature.
Exactly. I mean, you know, at this time, people were going to the play, and they weren't really connecting it necessarily with the high art in the way that we do. But this gave it a kind of literary credibility. And there's all sorts of reasons why the folio in of itself is interesting just as a document. There are mistakes that the compositors make where they accidentally name the actor rather than the character. So, for instance, in Much Ado About Nothing, they don't say Dogberry at one point, they say Kemp, and then we know, well, Will Kemp played this role. There's a list of actors at the start of the folio, which at the very top is the name Shakespeare. Shakespeare, people often forget, was an actor in his own company, and that's really key, because I think it's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is still so important and still so impressive, was that he knew the roles from within, he played the roles, and as you read it, you get this sense of, you'd have to be an actor to write these, because he has this singular ability to kind of metamorphise between characters. He can adopt different personas and ways of thought. In other words, he doesn't write characters that are all the same, that are all versions of himself. He takes incredibly different psychological positions, which is very unique.
And it remains very readable. I mean, there are obviously some bits of the English that mean slightly different things, but one of my children was home from school a week or 2 ago, and we read together Henry V.
Yes.
And it's easy for 11-year-olds to understand Henry V. It's not highfalutin high art.
Absolutely.
It is English language at its most beautiful, and it's most easily understandable, and it's most dramatic as well.
I find it very dispiriting that in a lot of educational circles they think that children can't handle Shakespeare, but they can, particularly if they hear it spoken aloud. You know, we're not dealing with Old English or even Middle English. This is Shakespearean English. which hasn't changed. You know, you can I mean, there are some words and some terms, some idioms, some references and allusions that we might not immediately grasp. But when you hear it out loud, the sense of it is very, very clear. And more than that, it's not just clear. I mean, it really gets to the heart of what it means to be a human being in a way that no playwright has done better since. That, to me, is why it's so important to return to Shakespeare. You know, this is 400 years ago, but has there been a playwright who has exceeded what he has done? No. Why is that?
And the characters are so lively and immediate. And as you say, reading it out aloud, and for anyone who's ever interested in making speeches, the cadences of Shakespeare are so beautiful that they have a natural oratorical flow.
Absolutely. I mean, he's writing at a time when the convention was to write in verse. So these are works of poetry. There are scenes where he shifts into prose, normally to denote comedy or sort of lower status characters or something like that. There's a really interesting moment in Julius Caesar where Brutus gives a speech after the assassination in prose, and then Mark Antony appears and improves upon that speech with a speech in verse. And it has a far more powerful rhetorical effect. And that's really interesting when you, again, when you hear it out loud, you can see you can hear what's going on. You can sense yourself being drawn along by the rhetoric of Mark Antony.
And it can be read by anybody. It's not the preserve of specialists and scholars.
I hate the idea that it's elitist. It really isn't.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And remember to tune in to Free Speech Nation, Sundays at 7 o'clock for more from Andrew. That's all from me. Up next, it's the great Mark Dolan. Mark, what's on your bill of fare this evening?
Well, it's the only story in town, Sir Jacob. The marches this weekend, which looks like they're going to go ahead. I'll get reaction from Christine Hamilton, Lee Anderson and TV comedy legend Jim Davidson, who's done a lot for the military over the years. Plus, 1 in 3 children goes to school hungry. Absolutely devastating. But is it the government's job to feed our kids? Plus, are police right to now use force to stop Just Stop Oil? Busy show, Jacob. We're live at 9.
Well, that all sounds extremely interesting and exciting, and I'm sure people want to hear about that. And I think parents have the main responsibility to ensure their children are fed before going to school. It's a bit hypocritical of me because I never eat breakfast. That's coming up all after the weather. I'm back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and you know the weather in Somerset already. It's glorious. Shakespearean weather in Somerset.
Good evening, it's Alex Burkill here again with your latest GB News weather forecast. Whilst there will be some clear and sunny spells through the next day or so, there will also be plenty of heavy and possibly thundery showers because low pressure across northern parts of the UK is dominating the weather, leading to a breezy and showery theme for many of us. As we go through this evening and overnight, showers across western parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland will become more widespread, filtering across many areas of England and Wales. Some of these could be heavy, possibly even thundery, but there will be some clear skies in between, especially across northeastern parts of Scotland. Here a touch of frost is quite likely, and even elsewhere a bit of a chilly start first thing on Thursday morning. Through the day itself, though, it is going to be a showery picture for many of us. The heaviest showers will be in places towards the west, exposed to the brisk winds. Also some hefty showers towards the far southeast as well. Likely to be driest across eastern areas and across central and northern Scotland, with some decent sunshine here, but temperatures a little on the low side. Highs around 8 or 9 Celsius, milder further south with highs around 11 or 12. Friday then gets off to a bit of a damp start across southern areas with some showery rain, but that clears away, and then we end up with a northerly wind. And in that northerly wind, we're going to see the most frequent showers across northern parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and perhaps fringing into western and eastern coasts. Elsewhere staying drier, and more dry weather to come as we go into the weekend before some wind and rain arrives later. Bye-bye.
Who is it? We're here for the show.